The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Dr David Clark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor is supporting this bill because we see that a fair system for the repayment of student loans is very important. Student loan repayments are a huge burden on hundreds of thousands of Kiwis. For those struggling to pay off student debt while paying the bills and saving for a house, it is galling to hear overseas-based borrowers making no attempt whatsoever to pay back their loans. We support the principle that underlies this bill in terms of making the system fairer, in terms of data matching to ensure that those who are trying to evade their responsibilities are called to account, and the broadening of the definition of income to ensure that these things are treated fairly. The bill will enable the IRD to share information with Customs to make it easier for them to get in contact with overseas-based student loan borrowers who are in default. And Labor expects every borrower to make an equal effort to pay back their student loan, whether they are overseas or at home. And there are some enormous challenges here when we acknowledge that half of those borrowers overseas are of unknown address. So we commend the government's effort to make the system fairer. There are problems with this bill. Many of them have been noted earlier in the earlier stages of the debate. Those problems are tied back, many of them, to my colleague is interjecting that Mr Bridges is the worst member of Parliament in Tauranga for 50 years. I can't possibly disagree with that, but I want to come back to the point, which is that the IRD are unlikely to be able to implement many of these changes, and that is illustrated very well in the bill, which contains a number of backdowns. There are, in this bill, a number of embarrassing positions for the government to be seen. It is in this bill very clear that the government has been forced to go back on legislation that it has recently passed because it is unable to implement it with the outdated computer system at IRD. Now, that outdated computer system is over 20 years old, the first mainframe computer system. And the government has spent tens of millions of dollars on consultants to get advice on how it should replace that system. But as yet, the public of New Zealand is none the wiser as to the time frame for that replacement, or indeed whether the government has any kind of credible planning around it at all. And that is a disgrace. The transparency around this process is also an embarrassment to the government. I have sought personally, under the Official Information Act, to get briefings on the tens of millions of dollars that have been spent in the effort to get advice on how to upgrade this 20-year-old computer system. And we know that the government is expecting to spend in the range of about $1 billion on this upgrade in due course, or at least that's the estimate Mr Keys put out there. The department itself suggested up to $1.5 billion. There have been other estimates in the media of somewhere around $700 or $800 million. Now, if we take a central point there and say it's over $1 billion that's about to be spent, it is shameful, in my view, it is shameful that the government cannot release anything other than the titles of documents for the past 2 years. I would assume that the department's advisors will be giving common sense advice on process for selecting a tender, somebody to win the tender when $1 billion of taxpayer money is being spent. I would have assumed there was transparency around this process and a desire for the wider public to understand that the government is really taking this seriously. We've had all kinds of debacles. Nova Pay is probably the highest profile and most recent. We've had debacles around the government's efforts to implement computer systems. We have fears on this side of the House that this government is really not across the issues, has not laid out a plan, and is stumbling along, spending taxpayers' money hand over fist for what may well be a disastrous project. There's no doubt that the systems need to be upgraded. The IRD is a department under pressure. There is $7 billion in tax that remains outstanding. Most recent estimate was $7.8 billion of New Zealand's taxpayers' money that remains outstanding. There's over 1 million returns at the IRD that are unprocessed currently. It is a department under pressure, and there were 70,000 phone calls that went unanswered in last year's July GST filing period. My colleague David Cunliffe has pointed out the problems with getting through on the telephone system at the moment at IRD. It is a department under stress. It's not being supported by the government. Staff have been cut around the area. I know that dozens of staff have gone from my own area in Dunedin because this government has been taking jobs out of the regions. The services are dropping. The experience of services, we heard in the Finance and Expenditure Committee, for the general public is becoming increasingly poor. The public are saying that they are unhappy with the level of service being offered, and we know that the system is creaking along, but the government seems like it is sitting on its hands. It is not addressing the issues with the computer system, and consequently in this bill here we have further retractions. We have the government stepping away from measures it has put forward because it knows now that it cannot implement them. It is stepping back, and it must be humiliating being over there on the back benches there on the other side of the House, because they see their own ministers putting legislation through, costing expensive parliamentary time, only later on to have to make embarrassing speeches, speaking favourably in glowing terms about their minister, the bills that their minister is putting through, when they know that a good part of the content of this bill is embarrassing backgrounds. It must be an awful place to be in, and that's probably why they take very short calls, those backbenchers opposite, and I can kind of understand that. If I was in their position, having to witness such embarrassing performance from the ministers, I too would be taking short calls because it's not a nice position to be in. And many of them are honourable and fine members of the House, and I do respect their integrity and being embarrassed by it. I can't point out which ones are, Mr Cunliffe. It would be unparliamentary to label the others and unkind. There's also in this bill one part that we object to in principle, and that is the creation of a czar clause. The creation of a Henry VIII clause in this bit of legislation, which is the government's attempt to cover itself for future humiliating backdowns. This bill, that itself contains humiliating backgrounds, contains another clause which says in future, if there are embarrassments, if we can't put things through in the computer system because it's too hard, because we haven't dealt with the computer system, we will give the minister regulation-making powers. Now, the significance of that should not be underestimated. We've heard from the committee that overlooks these things in Parliament that this is an increasing trend under this government. It is failing so miserably in managing government departments that it is giving itself powers to circumvent the usual parliamentary scrutiny that we would expect from any responsible government, because it is embarrassed by its own performance. Embarrassed, and rightly so. Mr Sabin, I think, is understanding the embarrassment and feeling the embarrassment that he is on the back benches defending a government that is having to put Henry VIII clauses into small bits of legislation that tinker with the rules around loan collection. And I would be embarrassed too, Mr Sabin. I understand your position. This bill creates some small steps towards fairness, as I said at the beginning of my address, and for that reason Labor will support it, because we believe that everyone should have to make a fair effort to repay the debt, because we want to see a sustainable student loan system, because we believe in supporting more students into tertiary education, not like this government that is increasingly placing restrictions around so that only those who are privileged can access education. We believe in expanding free education because we are the party of education. We don't believe it should only be for those who are already privileged. We have a very different view on this to the current government. So the principle of fairness, which creeps into this bill, probably against the government's wishes, is one we support, and we are pleased to see that some small loopholes being closed. We acknowledge the humiliation the government is facing with the backdowns in this bill, and Mr Speaker, we hope that they will deal with bigger issues that make a change for New Zealanders, rather than having to come to the House again with many, many, many more embarrassing bills.
Thank you. And